千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we delve deeply into the Daodejing by Lao Zi. So after two chapters that are quite long, 38 and 39, we suddenly come across a very short chapter of only 4 lines. Here's chapter 40 of the Daodejing. The returning is the movement of the Tao. The weak is the utilization of the Tao. The myriad things of the world are born of being. Being is born of non-being. That's it, just 4 lines. Now, I'll have quite a bit to say about the brevity of these lines in just a moment. For now, though, we have to do what we always do, which is to look for similar characters, the same repeating characters, in order to perceive the sections. When we have 4 lines in the Daodejing, it is very likely the same thing happens when we see even number of lines elsewhere, especially even number of lines of the same length. Those are likely to be poetic constructs. In this case, in the first 2 lines, we see that's definitely the case. You can see that lines 1 and 2 contain 3 characters that are exactly the same. And you can see the red highlights that I've put into place there. It helps us indicate that the first two lines are a couplet. They form a section. They have the same length. So, but then what about lines 3 and 4? They have different lengths. Line 3 contains 7 characters. Line 4 contains 4 characters. Well, they are actually repeating lines as well. And you can see them here. You can see that the characters before the end of the line, there are 2 repeating characters, and that justifies these 2 being the same section. And you can tell by looking at the translation, it's about born of being. Being is synonymous with existence, and then born of non-being. Non-being is synonymous with non-existence. So now let me talk about why chapter 40 is significant. I have a slide here specifically devoted to that. So first of all, this is actually not just a short chapter, it is indeed the shortest chapter of the entire Daodejing. So there are other short chapters also, but they contain more than 4 lines. So this one contains only 4 lines. This is a way for Lao Tzu to demonstrate saying the most with the least. As you will hear in our discussion today, although these lines are short, they contain a world of meaning. It is the practice of Tao sages to convey the most meaning with the least amount of words. And this is also something that you and I should try to do in life. Think about how most people are the very opposite. They talk a lot, but they say very little. Probably the worst example that we see would be bureaucracies of all kinds, whether at the workplace or in government, in organizations. The more bureaucratic people get, the more they stray away from the Tao. And in this case, it means that they will use a lot of words and they won't be able to say very much. They won't be able to express a whole lot of meaning. In fact, it seems like they express next to nothing when they use an incredible amount of words. So consider an example where what you want is a yes or no answer. Perhaps the question is, will you do XYZ or ABC? Will you do something? And you're looking for yes or no. Maybe if additional information is available, you want to hear the timing. Like, yes, we will do it tomorrow. Or yes, we will do it in a moment. Or no, we can't do it until blah, blah, so-and-so date at a particular time. That would be a simple way to answer a question. In a bureaucratic setting that we have all experienced, you can get a very lengthy answer that doesn't boil down to very much at all. For instance, consider the answer to the question, hey, will you do this and that? And the answer is, well, after taking numerous external and internal factors into consideration, and after consulting with a number of experts in the field, it has been determined that as of the present moment, the situation allows for no meaningful action to be undertaken without the unnecessary expenditure of time and energy and the exposure of unacceptable risk. And it goes on. What has been said? Well, the meaning is obscured. It's a very long and roundabout way to say, no, can't do it. So the Tao is the very opposite, is to say less and do more. So this chapter, I hope to demonstrate that the very short lines from Lao Tzu contain a world of meaning for us to explore together. So here's another factor that makes chapter 40 significant. It has a central position near the middle of the book of the Daodejing. This is the 40th chapter, and after this chapter, there are 41 more chapters to the very end of the Daodejing, to chapter 81 being the very end. So this is a position in the middle. Is that a coincidence? Well, perhaps not. So the one near the middle is also the shortest one out of the entire book. In that position, it serves as a reflection of concepts from other chapters. It's the center, if you will, and it reflects on and emphasizes on concepts like the Great Circle, that's in the first half, and then the emptiness of the Tao, that's in the second half. Probably not an accident that it came out that way. Lastly, I want to draw everyone's attention that chapter 40 belongs to the Tao book, the De book, the book of De. The three characters that I have here, this is the ancient seal script of Daodejing, because Daodejing, the first book, the first half of the book from 1 to 37 is about the Tao. The second half from 38 onward is about the character in the middle, which is virtue. So chapter 40 is in the second book, the book of virtues. In the first book, the book of the Tao, it already spoke of the Great Circle. In this one, it talks about the Great Circle again, which we will in just a moment, but it's in the book of virtues. Virtues, so here I want everyone to understand why that's different. The Tao is everything. It's the universe. It's heaven, earth, myriad things, its existence itself, the different levels of reality. The Tao is everything. The virtues is what we human beings do, is what we practice to get closer to the Tao. So the Tao is all inclusive. De is what we focus on. So the second book, has a human level emphasis on it. I want to make sure everyone understands that. When you apply that to these concepts, emptiness of the Tao, the great circle, well, something interesting happens, because when you apply the great circle to virtues, you end up with the concept that we are familiar with, the karma, that when you do something great, eventually you reap the benefits, that it comes back to you. The positive energy you put out there returns back. So keep that in mind as we explore this chapter. So we're about to get into the Daodejing, the first two lines now, starting with line 1. I am going to park the slide on the very beginning, like this. In a moment, we will get into the first line. The returning is the movements of the Tao. What does that mean? What does that imply? What is the interpretation? How can it benefit us? Then we will link it up with line 2, which is about the week. So what I would like to do now, because we've wrapped up chapter 39, we've done the sectional analysis and introduction of chapter 40. We're about to get into the line-by-line analysis of the 4 lines, and there's a lot to talk about. So now is actually an excellent time for us to take a 5-minute break. When we come back, we will begin with line 1, with the first 2 characters of line 1. Okay, so starting with line 1, the returning is the movements of the Tao. Let's single out the first 2 characters and talk about that. The returning. In this case, this is talking about that which reverses course. So the first character, fan, literally means reverse. Now, this is overall talking about a circular movement, a movement that goes out pretty far and then comes back to the point of origin, thus forming a great circle. Now, in this entire line, there is no specific reference to circle or going out quite far. So the valid question is, how do we know that that is the intended meaning? Well, we know because this chapter serves, from its central location, it serves as an echo of other chapters. So with Tao Te Ching, chapter 25 as an example, it provides lines, and first I want to point out that the first character translated as returning, and what I said just now is that literally means reverse. Notice how the first character here is the last character that I'm quoting here from Daodejing 25. It's the same character. It's actually talking about the same thing. Now, Daodejing chapter 25 is part of the book of the Tao, Daodejing, the first half. So it's describing characteristics of the great Tao. And the characteristics of the great Tao, the lines translate as, in the first character that I'm quoting here, Da, it means great. So the greatness of the Tao means passing. Passing means receding, going far away. Receding means returning, coming back. So it's pretty clear from chapter 25 and the other chapters of the Daodejing that the movements of the Tao is this great circular path, something that goes out far away and then comes back. Now the path itself, it doesn't need to look like a perfect circle. It doesn't even need to look like an ellipse. Here's what I mean by that. Let me go a little bit deeper into this. In the most basic requirements, the motion of the Tao is simply going somewhere and coming back. It doesn't have to be a circle. Think pendulum. So if you think about track and field, that's not necessarily built like a big circle either. It's more like an ellipse. So race car drivers know this, track and field athletes know this. There's going to be sections of the track that's relatively straight, and then there's the turning, there's the curvature, which can be different. So there's no strict requirement to be a perfect circle. It can vary greatly. For now, let's think about pendulum. The pendulum swings back and forth. It represents different states in life. It goes this way and then comes back. Life is sort of like that. Life makes many transitions from one state to another and then back again. You can probably imagine, for instance, a state may be happiness, let's say, and another state may be unhappiness. There's any number of times in your life when your mental states, your emotional states, your feelings have gone from a state of happiness to sadness. Now, because pendulum represents life, it's going to swing back around at some point. Even when you go through a tragic event, that, because the essence of life is change, that tragedy will not be forever. At some point, you'll swing back on the pendulum of feelings into a positive state again, so you can function in life. So when we talk about life, think about this metaphysical pendulum in your life, going back and forth. It's not just, suffering and happiness. It's everything else. We go through many transitions from many different states. So to help us see that, I will put up this image of the pendulum here and then talk about it a little bit more. So remember, now the Tao itself is it's a principle behind everything. It's embedded in everything. And a lot of times the sages will say it the other way. Whatever it is that is embedded in everything, whatever the principle is that underlies all other principles, well, we call it the Tao. Because it is embedded in everything, it's everywhere. That is the reason why it's going to show up everywhere we look. So first of all, it's embedded in everything, and that is the reason why we see circular movements or great circles everywhere in nature. And when I say nature here, I'm also referring to reality or existence, life itself. The universe. We can divide it up into 4 different levels and then talk about each level one by one. And that's just for the sake of simplicity. It's for the sake of more easily grasping or understanding these concepts. So we'll talk about circular movements or great circles in heaven, meaning the sky. We can also talk about circular movements or great circles in the earth, which is the surrounding environments. This is ground level reality. Then we can also address the manifestation of the circular, the cycles, the great circle among myriad things. And here I'm talking about living things. All living things, all the animals, all the plants, everything. Finally, we have to focus on human beings. We are part of the myriad things. We're living things too. So whatever applies to the myriad things, all the living creatures, they apply to us as well. But human beings have additional concerns, additional considerations that we will explore one by one. For the moment, let's just focus on the pendulum. And so that's the reason why I have the pendulum as the title for this slide. I want to give some quick examples of how the pendulum works in daily life. First, let me bring up training and victory. So a moment ago, I talked about athletes. Here, I want to quote Japanese samurai. Cry in the dojo, laugh on the battlefield. And here's the original Japanese. What does that mean? Well, I think you may have come across this particular saying before. It's quite true. It's very true. The training in the dojo is difficult. It's not something that one would enjoy. You have to be very motivated and disciplined to be training in the dojo every day. The difficulty of the training, it can leave you gasping for breath. It can leave you exhausted. You may not feel like doing it. But as harsh and exacting and demanding as the training may be, it's good for you. Why? Because it makes you stronger, faster, more proficient, so that it pays off when you need it the most. So in terms of your feelings, as you are suffering in the dojo, the place for training, the place for, usually this a dojo is in the context of martial arts training. When you are working your butt off in the training center, the dojo, you don't feel so great. You wish you can go home and relax, hang out, watch television. But once you have put in the work, although you suffer greatly through having to work out, having to strain yourself, once you've done that, you reap the rewards. So your mental state goes from suffering to elation, delight, happiness on the battlefield. The training pays off, and you attain victory, hence laugh on the battlefield. So the pendulum swings from negative emotional states in the training center to happiness on the battlefield as you dominate, as a samurai dominates. But then after the victory, pendulum is going to swing the other way again. Back to the dojo you go, back to the training grounds you go for even more training to maintain what you have already achieved in terms of your physiology and skills, and then to possibly attain a higher level of proficiency and mastery in the fighting arts. So that's one way to see the pendulum. It's swinging back and forth. Now, you may say, that's great. I've heard that saying before. It doesn't apply to me as much because, I don't fight. So I'm not a samurai warrior. So how would I see the pendulum in my life? And for that, I'll say, well, you actually do fight, but not necessarily against human opponents. There are many instances where you are fighting. So for instance, fighting for health. Here's another example, sickness and healing. This happens to everyone and happens from time to time. You catch the cold, you feel miserable. Doesn't have to be the cold either. It could be any kind of illness. But if it's the cold or the seasonal flu, well, you know that you suffered through it for about a week, and after that, you fought it off. So you feel much better. So your feeling, your pendulum goes from misery to feeling better, feeling healed up. So now that you feel much better, you've recovered, you can go back to work, you can engage in your favorite activities, you feel great. But here's what the Tao says. Listen, the pendulum is still in motion, so it's going to swing back. It just means that at some point in the future, you're gonna be sick again for something. Maybe not the same thing, but the pendulum will swing back at some point down the road. So that's another way to see the pendulum in action. I think everyone can identify with that example. So here's the Tao perspective. We can take all of that and distill it into the Tao, and we can use the yin and yang symbol for that. So I want everyone to try this. I want everyone to try visualizing your life as revolving around the yin and yang symbol, and I'll use a graphic here to help us do that. So as you can see here, I have the yin and yang symbol, and then I have these lines going through it, going through the center of it. Imagine that you are moving around the perimeter of the yin and yang symbol, and at any one time, you have a varying amount of brightness and darkness in your life. Where I have signified brightest, that's the most amount of the bright. And then where on the opposite end, there's also darkest, where things are at the absolute worst, without a whole lot of good, without a whole lot of positive. So think about your life in terms of this. And let me say a couple of things about that. First of all, this graphic would suggest to you that nothing is ever 100%. Sometimes it feels that way, but there's always a little bit of the opposite. There's always a little bit of yin in the yang, always a little bit of yang in the yin. And then the other thing that I would also suggest is that as you go around and around, transitioning, having the pendulum swing this way and that, back and forth, you're not always proceeding at the same speed. So if you think about the change from day to night, back to day again, or the changing of seasons, that's pretty regular. It's on a schedule. So the amount of time is roughly the same. As you go through the positive to the negative and back to the positive again, the amount of time may not be the same. You may spend way too much time in the negative, only a little bit of time in the positive. That's what I'm trying to say. You may speed up or slow down as you go from brightness to darkness and back again. So there's a couple of questions that I have for you. I would like to get people to think about this, and if possible, also enter your response, your answers. Couple of questions. Right now in life, where would you say you are? Mostly brightness, mostly darkness, about half and half, maybe a little bit more of one than the other, hopefully more positive than negative in your life right now. And for those of you who say that, well, it's actually more darkness than brightness at the moment, I really hope that our discussion today and our continuing study of the Tao will be helpful to you so that you can utilize some of the concepts, some of the ideas that you hear about in our talks to help you get to a better place in life. Then here's another question, and this is just me asking for your opinion. When I'm talking about positive and negative like this, brightness and darkness, so is this about suffering like in Buddhism? And I feel like it's important to address this because oftentimes Buddhist teachings and Tao teachings are liberally mixed up together. In the West, it's pretty hard to find people who really understand the subtle nuances and differences between the two. So when we talk about Buddhism, suffering is a big topic. We'll get into that in just a moment. And I also want to talk about how that is different from the way that we look at things in the Tao. So you'll learn a little bit about Buddhism, but also a little bit about the Tao. Let me also say that it is oftentimes not very helpful to ask Eastern people about the difference between Buddhism and the Tao. Most of them don't really have clear notions either, because they've grown up in a culture where the two are liberally mixed together, not just in the present day Asian culture, but also throughout history. Okay, I'm seeing additional answers, some of which are excellent, and I like the fact that for quite a few people, the practice of the Tao is helping to bring more brightness into your life, and I hope it continues to be the case. So before we get into all that, let me make sure everyone understands where Buddhism came from and the way that it's practiced in the West. And this is something that I talked about quite a bit in the past. Today, I'll provide a summarized version. The Buddhism that we know about in the West is highly diluted. It's watered down for Western consumption. In a moment, you'll see the reason why. So under Buddhism, I have the westernized version of Buddhism, and then the original Buddhism. This is the Buddhism that I grew up with, that I experienced firsthand, that I read about growing up in Asia. So in the West, I definitely notice a very obvious tilt toward the positive. Buddhism in the West is the happy-go-lucky kind of Buddhism. It, in some ways, does not resemble closely the Buddhism that I knew in Asia. So let me lay them out. Westernized Buddhism says the essence of life is good and positive. The original Buddhism doesn't talk about that. No, the original Buddhism, the concept is quite different. Original, authentic Buddhism says the truth of life is this interesting term, dukkha. Dukkha is oftentimes rendered as suffering, but dukkha can range from imperfection or something that's not quite satisfactory, like a vague feeling of dissatisfaction, all the way to what is called dukkha dukkha, repeating the term twice, meaning great physical, painful, miserable suffering. So dukkha has a great range. So the original conception about the truth in life from authentic Buddhism is about dukkha, the noble truth of suffering. That suffering is everywhere. Suffering is pervasive. Suffering is unavoidable if we live this life in this unawakened state. You see very little about that in the westernized version of Buddhism because the emphasis is on happiness. Indeed, in the West, our goal in life, according to Buddhism, is about the art of happiness. So I am not making that up. That's from the book by the Dalai Lama about the art of happiness. And that is about as westernized and diluted, as watered down as it gets. So Westerners are following a different kind of Buddhism than is often the case throughout Asian history. So what is the original? What is the original formulation of Buddhism? The goal is not the art of happiness, it's to be liberated from samsara. What is samsara? It is the wheel of birth, life, and death, or the way that I usually hear it taught in Asia is that samsara is the wheel of birth, death, and rebirth. That it doesn't end. It does not end upon physical death. It continues on. So in the East, the idea is that when you go through life, you go through dukkha, suffering, which in Mandarin is 苦. 苦 means bitterness. So every Asian is familiar with this concept, growing up in that culture. And it makes sense that historically there's been long periods of time in which Asian cultures have gone through a lot of hardship. So it's natural that they associate life, existence, with 苦, bitterness. They even call it 苦海, the ocean of bitterness. That's dukkha. So the goal is not so much to practice the art of happiness, but to be liberated from the suffering, from dukkha, from bitterness, to be free of the ocean of bitterness. Again, in the West, emphasis is on happiness. In a way, it's human nature because, frankly, relatively speaking, life is easy in the West. Therefore, the emphasis in the West is about detaching from the negative, focusing on the positive. The original Buddhist teachings, a little bit different. Detach from everything, positive or negative. This is because if you are attached to the good things in life, enjoyment, delights, love, friendship, everything, then according to Buddhist teachings, you will have trouble freeing yourself from the wheel of samsara because you like it so much, you don't want to let go of it. Makes sense? That's not reflected in the Western version. In the Western version, you go on silence retreats where you see signs like remember to smile. And there is a book called Pause, Breathe, and Smile. in the original, why all that smiling? Why all that happiness? You should be thinking about liberation from having to endure another existence. Very different. But then if you look at the original, wow, that's going to have a very hard time being accepted in the West. Because, as I said, life is relatively easy in the West. This is also why sometimes Eastern masters will shake their heads ruefully and say, you Westerners will never understand the true teachings. There's a distance between the Westernized version and the original authentic teachings. So now that you understand the original Buddhism or have hopefully a better idea than before, there are some distinctions to describe from Buddhism and the practice of the Tao. Before we leave this slide, let me also say that there are as many variants of Buddhism as anything else. If you are familiar with Christian sects, you know how many different variations there are. So human nature being what it is, human beings being who they are, there's always gonna be variations on everything. So from the original historical Buddhism, there has been variations on it, but I'm here to tell you that throughout history in Asia, Buddhism has veered much, much more closely to what you see on the right-hand side in this slide. If you grew up and live there, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. It is when Buddhism is transplanted to the West that suddenly the minority view, the happiness school, the smiling all the time school, suddenly gains a whole lot of traction, suddenly becomes emphasized everywhere. So I just want to make sure that people know what the difference is. Not my intention to criticize anything. There are very valid reasons in every school to believe exactly as they do. It's my job to present you with the overview. So now let's take a look at how differently the Tao perspective can be when we look at some of these things, especially in view of this particular chapter. So this is important. This is the purpose. This is really the end goal for which we went on that little side detour into Buddhism, is because I want to make the points that are important in this particular slide. So we're going to line up what the Buddhists, traditional Buddhists are taught, and you can see the truth of what I'm saying by looking up the encyclopedia entries on Buddhism. Unavoidably, every single one of them in every encyclopedia will start out talking about dukkha, the teaching about the truth of dukkha in life, the imperfection and suffering. So the Tao cultivators see life in a different way, so that life, the essence of life, is not about suffering or dukkha or dissatisfaction. The essence of life from the Tao perspective is change. Constant change, changing all the time. So if I were to ask a Tao cultivator who really understands the Tao, I would ask a question. If I ask a question like, is not dukkha present in life? Is not suffering or imperfection present in life? Don't you see it? The correct answer from the Tao cultivator is yes, sometimes it is. Now, the Buddhist, the authentic traditional Buddhists will say, well, no, it's all the time. It's not just sometimes. And the Tao cultivator will say, well, my position is that everything changes, including suffering. So the other point is about samsara. Because the original teaching of Buddhism is about ku, bitterness, the ocean of bitterness. So then the goal is to be liberated from samsara, the wheel of birth, life, and death, or as I mentioned, birth, death, and rebirth. So that's the goal. What about for the Tao cultivator? Well, because the Tao cultivator starts out thinking about life as constant change. Change meaning a transition from one state to another state. Because of the changes and transitions, the goal is not necessarily to be liberated, but to master the transitions from one state to another. So as I mentioned, we spend a different amount of time in one state to another. It's not evenly split. It isn't like you go for 10 hours of suffering and then 10 hours of pure bliss and then back to 10 hours of suffering again. That doesn't happen. The skillful Tao cultivator will figure out the reason for the transition, the necessity for particular states, and then master those transitions for his or her own reasons. More on that later. For now, let's focus on the distinctions. So in Buddhism, traditional Buddhism detached from everything. Yes, Western students of Buddhism, this includes the smiles, all the things that you love and take delight in, the positive as well as the negative, and this will allow you to finally be free of samsara. Becoming too attached to anything will prevent the liberation from occurring. So the concept of detachments, attachments and detachments in the Tao looks a little bit different. In the Tao, the idea is that it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. So detach from end results, focus on the process. Immerse yourself in the process, the living process going from one state to another, rather than exactly where you're going to end up, what your score is going to be at the very end. From the perspective of the Tao cultivator, that doesn't make a lot of sense. To be obsessed over the score, to be keeping track of score. So now, as you can see, even with just one line out of 4 in Daodejing chapter 40, there is plenty to talk about. There's so much to talk about. And time passes very quickly when we talk about stuff like that. So it is already time for us to jump to the summary for today. The summary for today, because we're not quite done with the beginning of chapter 40, I'm going to summarize what we talked about at the end of chapter 39. So here's what the summary looks like for today. We started out talking about the end of 49, about being more like the rock. This is the last line from chapter 39. So this is the final concept from 39. I have several suggestions on being more like the rock. Number 1, low-key, low profile. To do things in a low-key way, keeping a low profile. So from the end of 39, you can see that while other people may prefer to shine like jade, the Tao cultivator does not require that attention, does not have craving to attract attention. I do see a lot of people who do have that craving. They, for instance, are the ones who are obsessively posting in social media, wanting to get some kind of reaction from the people who follow them. So to be like the rock is to not require that amount of attention from other people. It's a bottomless pit. Number 2, quietness, silence. The rock doesn't say anything, so the Tao cultivator, in emulation of that, will use less words, make less noise, and at the same time, work on increasing the meaning that you express, the impact that you have. So less talking, more doing is what this one really says. And then, number 3, gravitas, steadiness. To be like the rock is to be thoughtful, the reliable anchor that other people can depend on, other people can trust. If you are true to the spirit of the Tao, you can see that 1, 2, and 3 are musts. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us travel safely. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.